No. Okay. All right. 6:30. Record button has been pressed. Go ahead.
Oh, welcome. Well, thank you all for joining me today. And, especially I'd like to thank Sam and Gabriella for organizing this, and Gabriella especially for reaching out to me and knowing that I had an interest here and inviting me to prepare a presentation. I was jumped at the chance. So I'm really grateful for that personal touch that you just never get with a conference, when somebody just says, hey, I think you should show up and present. So I'm really, really happy I could be here. And something that I have been thinking about for a long time, and finally, because of the efforts of Sam and Gabriella to organize this, said this is the time to put it to paper and present it. So the work that I am doing here is really going to be wrestling with the ethics around catch and release angling and catch and keep angling. So because this is a new area for me to be presenting on, I'm not entirely familiar with how much an audience will typically know. So what I'd like to give permission to anyone to interrupt or pause at some point if I am using a term that they don't understand, or if I'm assuming knowledge that is not widespread, that you can stop me to ask me to clarify something or explain something further. So please, with all of you, you have my permission to interrupt me. So I'm going to begin here sharing my screen. And I can make it so I can maximize it. So the title here, should we let them go to let them grow? This is something, a common refrain. If you spend any time in angling communities, you'll hear people talking about this idea of, and it's sort of to explain the catch and release ethos that, let the fish, after having caught the fish, let it go so that it can return to the wild to be caught again. Hopefully in a bigger state, so that you can enjoy having caught an even larger fish to then let go and hopefully in the future catch again. When I got into the topic, what I was initially surprised by is how little research has focused on the ethics of angling. And there is a bit, and I'm going to provide a little bit of literature review here, but when you compare it to what has been written about the ethics around game hunting, which I know, Sam, you've written quite a bit on this topic, that when you compare the ethics of angling to the ethics of hunting, it's surprising for me the difference in the amount of literature. And I suspect that parts of it has to do that we've sort of allocated different moral spaces to fish than to other animals. And I'm not sure that that allocation is logically consistent, nor does it fit with science. The point that has been made in some of the research is that the term hunting has a certain connotation that fishing does not, even though if you look at the acts, the two acts are very similar in their nature. And so there really shouldn't be the necessarily the wall that people have put up. And I think some of it has to do with just historical ways that society has viewed fish as being somehow different than land dwelling counterparts. And again, I would say this is not supported by any sort of scientific claim. And I do think there's been some good arguments that have shown this to be a logically an inconsistent divide. Simply dwelling in water versus land does not change a moral status of a creature. And I also think that the widespread, and I will say this is an incredibly widespread practice among anglers, especially in fly fishing communities where people are using completely artificial flies and lures, so they don't use any natural bait. It's all going to be feathers and fur and cloth lures for fish. That the practice of catch and release angling in many ways deflect some of the same scrutiny that is given to hunting, because a catch and release angler can practice their sport without there being the obvious death of the fish at the end of the activity that would challenge some people. So I think because this does not inherently end in the fish's death, some people have sort of given this a pass as far as moral scrutiny. But that's say there is some good literature on the topic, and in particular, Elder has a great recent article here in the Palgrave Handbook for Animal Ethics that really challenges the idea of catch and release angling or recreational angling, which is I'm not a term that I'm not committed to. Elder and others will define recreational angling as primarily angling that is catch and release. And so there's almost a stipulation if I were to be taking them at their word to say I'm not talking about recreational angling, because they define recreational angling as catch and release angling. And I'm going to be introducing an idea of angling that would include catch and keep for food. But the basic point that Elder introduced is that at surface catch and release angling meets this definition of a cruel act, and it seems to be unavoidable. And I think it's a fairly strong case. If we start with this definition of a cruel act that involves the voluntary infliction of unnecessary and avoidable pain, it's pretty easy to see that simply hooking a fish, landing it in a net, pulling it out of the water, unhooking a fish to release it is to some degree causing unnecessary and avoidable pain, just simply for the angler to have the pleasure of the excitement of trying to bring a fish into a net only to let it go again. Wadewell similarly points out that it is true that catch and release recreational fishing appears particularly problematic given that the intention is not to kill, and more describes what's happening here in the purpose of angling. So a second article that is critical of catch and release angling. These are two articles that I sort of take as a starting point for the conversation. I see a lot of merit in the objection that both of these scholars have raised in terms of the ethics around simply to try to catch a fish for pleasure and then release it. Even using the best practices for catch and release angling, there still is estimated around a 1% to 2% mortality rate, but then also a much higher rate of injury. So the likelihood of really engaging in long-term recreational catch and release angling, there will inevitably be some harm to the fish. At the same time, the broader practice of catch and release angling has led to some very damaging environmental practices, most notably the stocking of fish that are non-native into waters. And depending on how much you might know about the fish populations around the country, but probably one of the most famous types of trout most people have heard of is the rainbow trout. And rainbow trout you can now find in all 50 states, even though it was only indigenous to the Pacific Rim. Similarly, you can find brown trout in many places throughout the United States, even though brown trout is native to Europe. But you can find wild brown trout in the Colorado River, and up in Yellowstone as well. So because of human practices of stocking of game fish, we've introduced many fish into places where they're not native, and in fact that has directly caused some species to become endangered because those fish are feeding on other amphibious life. So one of the most famous examples is the introduction of game fish into Rocky Mountain National Park led to a certain type of frog to become extinct, because the fish that had been introduced were eating the tadpoles. So there's many problems that have come with the recreational angling for catch and release. But I'm not sure that the critical arguments necessarily fit with catch and keep angling. And this is where anglers are engaging in the sport of angling, but with the purpose of bringing fish home for food. And this is going back to an older book, and not necessarily a philosophical book, but Lewis, makes this claim to catch fish and not kill any fish is both disrespectful to the fish and a betrayal of the angler's heart. And I take some agreement in this, that what the point the person is saying is that by the harm in releasing the fish, to not having caught it, to not having harvested it, is somewhat disrespectful to the fish. You've gone through all this unpleasantness of having brought it into net and then released it. At the same time, that there's an element that the angler that this person sees in the angler being a source of providing food. This is not without criticism. Elder specifically points out Lewis's point, which is to say, landed or not, and this is in a direct response to Lewis, the fish in a harvesting scenario are sometimes caught and released, which introduces the unnecessary harm. And this is true, that oftentimes, despite an angler's best effort, they're going to catch fish that are too small to be worth harvesting, that these fish would be of very little nutritional benefit, and it's much better to release the fish and let that fish return to the river in order to grow or to produce sustainable fish later on. So this is where sort of I think the literature is at the moment, is can we really come up with a case that can sustain catch and keep angling? And I look at the question about, okay, so what degree is violence and death considered unnatural and unnecessary? And I know a lot of discussion around food has basically said any killing of any animal is unnecessary, given that we can create a diet entirely of food sources that don't involve killing. I'm not convinced that this is an ethically consistent view, but it's a much broader conversation than I can take today, the conversations around the ethics of sustainable food. I think that there's some objections that have been raised that say that, okay, we need a more nuanced view of diet beyond simply is an animal life lost or an animal life affected by the food choices we make. But the debate hinges on this idea of violence. So I'm going to delve in here and talking about, really there's been two opposing views, both of which I'm going to kind of go past for a second. The Western Western non-feminist environmental philosophy, which has adopted a view of domination and destruction, I think has been particularly harmful. At the same time, we've seen some effects around the feminist or deep ecological views that have adopted a view of stewardship and care so as to avoid any death. And this has also similarly had some problematic effects on animal populations, because at this point now we're to a place where there is no animal population that has not been affected by human behavior, and now in some sense has to have some response of stewardship to it. So I'm going to turn over and look at and draw upon in indigenous ethics here. And I want to preface this by saying, I don't identify as a member of any indigenous group. And I'm very cautious to be drawing upon ethical views from a group that I don't necessarily identify with, in the fear that I'm misrepresenting or appropriating views. But I'm drawing on scholarship in this area to identify a set of views, overlapping views that share a family resemblance. And particularly, I'm going to be drawing upon Native American views from the Pacific Northwest. And I'm going to be drawing upon those through the work of Gary Snyder, who's a writer and scholar in the Pacific Northwest, but also a practicing Buddhist who's developed an ecological framework that I find particularly nuanced and interesting, and also helpful for this direct debate. That Snyder has researched extensively with Native American populations and is very familiar with the Native American stewardship and ecology, but also has found a lot of richness in Buddhist philosophy. So Snyder is a practicing Buddhist, but also expressly rejects the first precept of Buddhism. And so is not following a strict vegetarianism that would be normal among practicing Buddhists. And he's very conscious of this choice, but believes it's still to be consistent with his philosophical understanding of humans' place in the world. And this is a quote from Snyder. So the first precept referring to Buddhism here goes beyond a concern just for organic life. And part of what he's making here is that what we can worry about the taking of animal life, but organic life being a far broader understanding of energy. Yet our stance in regard to food is a daily manifestation of our economics and ecology. Food is the field in which we daily explore our harming of the world. So far, it has been the earlier subsistence cultures of the world, especially hunters and gatherers, who have paradoxically most beautifully expressed their gratitude to the earth and its creatures. And now he's referring it as Buddhists. We have something yet to learn on that. And so, here Snyder is sort of saying that a practicing Buddhist believes that there's still much that Buddhism can learn from indigenous philosophical views in relation to food. But the particular idea is that Snyder is quite aware of and uses his own language. We daily explore our harming of the world. And I think this is something that I find common to indigenous philosophy around ecology and stewardship, is that there's an awareness of obligation and connectedness, but that it involves an inherent violence, an awareness of violence being a natural and normal part of the environment, so that you can't have a state in which all animals are peacefully living together in the same space, that certain animals eat others and so on. And that's part of the natural world. So drawing on this idea here with the indigenous ethics, I think that this is where you can begin to see a practice of angling, where a person is going out and engaging in challenges to catch fish in a way that is in the least environmentally damaging and the most sustainable. So not using gill nets, not using treble hooks that would be causing a lot of damage, but engaging in a type of angling that is recognized as the most minimally effective on fish, but balancing that with a gratitude toward the harmed. So an awareness of the necessity of harm, a gratitude towards those being harmed, and with that a moral obligation to mitigate and repair the harm caused by the necessity of harm. So a fish needs to be harvested to be eaten, aware that is a harm, and then that person or that community having then an obligation of stewardship back to the group that is harmed, so that the environment can continue. So this is in this context, I think that you can imagine a scenario in which anglers, aware of how fish are part of an ecology and an ecosystem, can engage in the practice in a way that is to provide local food to eat. But there's going to be some important caveats here, and I know I'm just about out of time, but the major shifts in the practice of angling would have to follow, and these are really major shifts. First, ending of all stocking practices. And stocking practices, there's just growing evidence that stocking practices are having a lot of harms on the different fish ecologies. So ending of stocking practices, putting fish in water for anglers to go target, and instead focusing on restoring native fish populations. And so this may mean that certain waters are become unfishable until native fish populations can be returned to healthy levels. But it also may include, in the short term, harvesting of non-native fish from wild fish populations. And in fact, if any of you were to fish the rivers in Idaho, specifically the Henry's Fork, they have a bounty program now on people that harvest rainbow trout in order to get the rainbow trout out of their system to provide biomass for native cutthroat trout to return. This would also mean limits on angling to only allow angling in specific seasons in which the effects on the fish population would be minimal. So avoiding times when fish are spawning or when fish would be in stress during periods of high temperatures or cold temperatures. At the same time, again, artificial lures, no live bait. There's a lot of evidence around the use of live bait and the hooks affecting fish because of how they swallow the live bait versus the artificial. Similarly, barbless hooks, which have been shown to minimize a lot of the damage on fish, so that if a fish is returned to the water or if a fish is not captured in angling, that there will be less damage to the fish. So what I envision is a practice where fishing is seen as part of ecology and stewardship, but it is probably going to be limited to a far narrower season. And to use another Pacific Northwest hobby, the natives to the Pacific Northwest engage in, which is mushroom hunting, done in such a way as to be very careful, to have minimal environmental impact, and for very narrow windows where it's seen as an activity limited in scope, which is, again, a far different picture of recreational angling than we currently have, where it can be engaged in year-round practices with very, very few restrictions on what anglers can do. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm more than happy to now take any questions over the presentation.
John, I have tons of questions.
Thank you very much, John.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you. If the dog has a question. John, just more of a conversational question. Have you heard of ikejime? It's a Japanese term, a Japanese practice. It's ikejime, ikejime.
Yes, you're talking about how a fish is killed.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, so I was fascinated to learn about ikejime because at least the underlying idea is that this technique of killing a fish prevents it from having this hormonal response of the trauma of being captured.
Yeah.
Which of course presumes that being captured is a trauma for the fish, a genuine hormonal trauma. Yes. Which would kind of get back to this, but I guess we're just talking about it at this point, but I just wanted to see if you were aware of it, because I was not aware of it until a few months ago. But a more serious question, are you thinking more than in ecological terms, in terms of like, well, I mean, our next presentation is going to talk about Leopold and the land ethic. Are you thinking along those terms, or are you thinking about fish welfare at an individual micro level?
Yeah, well, Sam, so many great questions. So I do adopt a view that all living parts of an ecosystem have a moral status that cannot be ignored. So it's not a view of domination and subjugation. So you have to be aware of the moral status of everything in the environment. And so yes, fish have a moral status, and that there's an awareness there, as well as the animals that also feed on the fish. So the ecosystem has a moral status. With the ikejime, Absolutely. So that was actually a very pivotal turning point in me. It's absolutely clear that fish have a hormonal response to being caught, and the quicker one. I don't like using euphemisms, but the term that Ikejime is going to use is the processing of a fish. I feel like that euphemism ignores some of the action, but I'm to be consistent there. So the processing of fish, but which is attempting to limit the damage to the fish meat that's caused by the hormonal response of catching the fish. It's a stress response, and stress causing a breakdown in muscle. And so the faster that you can process the fish in this way, the less damage to the meat that is caused, but also one could say the less suffering the fish goes under. And so there might be some, and I certainly actually, I use sort of a modified practice of that if I'm going to harvest a fish, because being aware of how a fish suffers. So from taking it out of the water, how long you're going to keep it out of the water is going to have an effect. And so yeah, those are great questions, but to your direct point, I think there's a lot to be acknowledged with the Ikejime harvesting practice, but also I take a view of there being moral status across the environment and ecosystem.
And I don't want to dominate the questions, but do you include in that non-animals such as
yes.
Fungi? Okay, just
yeah,
making sure.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where I think some of the larger conversations around food sources come in, which is to say, when you think about environment and energy and living creatures, drawing a line between vertebrates and invertebrates, and again, there's so having a broader notion of moral status around living creatures. And I think that for Snyder, that's one thing that Snyder does really well, and why I was drawn to his work is he sees that moral status following around energy, and that the energy that's at the root of life is not going to be clearly defined based on whether something has 2 feet, 4 feet, a vertebrae, et cetera. Yeah, Jan, go ahead.
Thank you very much, John. I really liked your presentation. I'm very much torn in a similar way, I guess, in the way in which you might be torn. On the one hand, I do think that there is a continuum between fish and invertebrates and plants and fungi, etc. But I also think that there's a discontinuity. And I have certainly greater reservations about killing a fish than about killing a fungi. A fungus? A fungus.
No.
And then killing a plant for that matter. But I can imagine that there may be several reasons why eating fish can be a practice that must be endorsed in some situations. One of them is the argument that you come up with in terms of the impact that non-native species might have on native species. How much damage do we do to some environments by introducing non-native species? And maybe we can undo some of that damage by removing these species. Another one is the importation of fruit and vegetables from goodness knows where.
Yes.
Where you can actually eat locally sourced foods. And I think that's a strong argument as well.
Jan, can I just say what you said is very important, and certainly I wish I'd stressed more, but part of this is to get back to the locally sourced food as opposed to the global food network that has some major environmental impacts. I'm so glad you brought that point up.
Yes. And there was a third one as well. It's not because of you I've forgotten, I just forgot it.
Oh.
So if I think of it, I'll send it along.
It is 7 o'clock Eastern time at least. So I'm sorry to stop the conversation, John.
Sam, could I
continue?
Just butt in for
yes,
just 1
please.
second?
Yes, please do.
Sorry. Here on the East Coast in New Brunswick, one of our biggest economies is around fish and the Atlantic salmon. We've seen an almost entire collapse of the Atlantic salmon fishing industry and of the fishing population, the fish population. And part of this is due to much higher temperatures. We've been in a drought situation for God knows how many decades now. So water levels are low, water temperatures are high. And with catch and release, research shows that 35 to 70% of fish die after catch and release. So in addition to all the other ethical issues, you know, those are some things that we really have to factor in here around sustainability. Anyway, sorry.
The statistics around catch and release vary quite a bit, but the water temperature, which if you noticed, I specifically say that is a time where you have to forbid it, because the mortality rate when water temperatures are above a certain level is incredibly high. Yeah. And so that, but also, you know, I'm very careful around the commercial fishing. I think has far more moral objections than the recreational. And again, in the larger paper, that'll be something that I'll try to tease apart, is also setting aside commercial fishing. But I'm really grateful for both of those points. I'm aware of time, so I don't want to take up the next presenter's time. So thank you.
Thanks very much, John.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for everyone.
I found my third one, but I'll send it to you some other time. We're out of time, aren't we?